bit of preface here. I was around 10 to 11 years old when this happened. Old enough to stay home alone, but not old enough to recognize some red flags. I attended camp over the summer, the typical 8 to 3 routine. My house sits close to the end of my street, which forms a U, but for some reason, the bus driver would never drop me off at my house. I would always get dropped off at the end of my street, where I would toddle myself along back home. Both my parents worked late hours, sometimes not getting home until 8 p.m., and it would be very expensive to hire a babysitter for 4 to 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So, starting 6th grade, when the bus dropped me off at home, I would be by myself. I'd do the usual middle school routine, play games online, and watch TV. Occasionally, my neighbor's cat would come into my backyard, and I would feed and pet her as a way to get outside. The only computer in the house was in my dad's workroom, which has a window overlooking the deck and a window overlooking the side of the house. We have large bay windows in the living room, dining room, and kitchen of my house, and since we sit on a hill, you can pretty much see the entire backyard from a nice vantage point. So most days when I got home, I'd toss off my backpack and go right to that room, and you could see me walk from my front door and pop up by the computer from outside. Unfortunately, this would lead to something that I had forgotten about up until now. When I got off the bus, I did as expected, go into my dad's workroom and play computer games. About 30 minutes into this, I can hear faint meowing coming from the outside window. I pause the game and look outside, thinking maybe my neighbor's cat had wandered over. Nothing. I just sat back down and resumed playing, only to hear the meowing again. It was quiet, but noticeable, and so I checked the other window. Nothing again. This routine happened for a good 10 minutes, and eventually I got frustrated and went into the living room to watch TV. Not even 2 minutes later, meowing from the window I was sitting right beside. Now, I was confused and a little creeped out, so I shut the blinds and kept trying to watch TV. The meows continued, but only when they came from the window right behind me did I jump and leave the living room, officially skeeved. I went into my bedroom where the blinds were down but still cracked for some sunlight. I tried to read a book, only to hear a meow come from outside my bedroom window. This was enough to make me call my dad, concerned that maybe the cat was hurt, but I couldn't see it to be sure. He said he would have the neighbor come check it out and call me back later. 10 minutes go by, and I get a call from my dad saying he was coming home from work. Nothing urgent in his voice, just that his job had gotten cancelled and he could come home early. I thought nothing of it, and when he got home did I realize the cat noises had stopped. Fast forward to the present, and I asked my dad about the strange incident, thinking it was funny the cat had followed me around. What he told me next made my blood run cold. After I called him, my neighbor did indeed come to check on the house. What he found were large footprints, leading in circles all around the house, clustered close to the wall so that even if I looked outside, I wouldn't see anything. Someone had been stalking me through my house, seeing where I was through the windows, and making cat noises to try and get me to come outside. They must have known I was home alone, since it was easy to see me walk by myself down the street and let myself in. My neighbor immediately called my dad and searched the property, but found no one. The police weren't called, since there was nothing but footprints that led off into the woods and got lost, and I never saw anyone. My dad stayed home with me for the rest of the week, It sickens me to know that there are people who would use these tactics to try and lure kids out of their homes, and from there, do whatever they wanted with them. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I'd often find myself bored after my roommate, who's decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open and wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him, and then he had started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling a smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was just a whimper. Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off of the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. This happened when I was around 12 years old. It was in the middle of the night at my house. My dad would work the graveyard shift at his work, and since it was the weekend, I had stayed up most of the night. It was somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m., and my dad had told me to lock the doors and to go to sleep, which I did. I went to my room and finally went to sleep, but only for about an hour, when, at around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of knocking on my back door. It scared me awake. After taking a few moments to process what I heard, I decided it was probably just my dad knocking at the door. Maybe he just forgot something? Me being really exhausted, I knew he had a house key on him, so I just told myself he'd unlock the door himself. But the knocking continued. It was pretty creepy. Then the next thing I knew, the knocking stopped. And then it started again, but at a different location. Someone was now knocking on the window in my kitchen. I continued to assure myself it was my dad. I didn't understand why he couldn't just unlock the door himself. He always had a key on him. I felt pretty freaked out, so I wasn't answering the door. If anything, my dad would call me to open the door on my phone, which is next to me. The knocking started again at another window. I was terrified now. Too scared to get up and check who was out there. The knocking wasn't stopping, and the next thing I know, the knocking moved to my front door. At a harsher level too. That's when it hit me that I couldn't move. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't scream, or talk, or move any muscle. My heart was dropping as the knocking moved to another window, closer and closer to my bedroom window, where my curtains were see-through. I still could not move. I didn't know what to do or say. I can only stay out as my fear consumed me. I moved my eyes over to the window, and my heart stopped when I saw a man peering through the window. A tall man with a dark ski mask. I could hardly make out the details because it was so dark, but I think his mask had some sort of skeleton design on it. He tilted his head slightly. I tried to scream, but nothing came out of me. I closed my eyes hard and started telling myself that it wasn't real. over and over again. I open my eyes and there's no one there. I sighed a relief until I heard a loud whisper tell me, "I'll cut you." Everything suddenly stopped. I could finally move again a little while after, but I really couldn't sleep anymore that night. It didn't feel like a dream. I've never experienced sleep paralysis before, and everything felt so real. I don't know what had happened, but I pray I'll never have to experience that again. It was one of the most frightening moments in my life that I've ever dealt with. However, since I was home alone that day, nobody could back me up. But the following morning, I asked my dad when he came back from work if he came back earlier that day and knocked on the doors and windows. He didn't.